My brother walked into the disciplinary hearing smiling, playing the hero, as he accused me of practicing medicine illegally. I did not argue or shake. I simply watched the presiding auditor open the file. His face turned ghost white. He stood up abruptly, clutching the folder like a dark secret, and vanished into his chambers without a word. That was the moment I knew someone was getting destroyed tonight. But it was certainly not going to be me. My name is Lauren, and as I sat at the defendant's table, I realized that silence is the loudest sound in the world when your own family is trying to bury you. Welcome to the Narratives by Nora channel. I'm behind the wheel today, and as I drive, I've been reflecting on how betrayal often comes from those closest to us. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it there? I'll check your comments as soon as I pull over. For now, let's return to Lauren and that chilling silence in the tribunal. The room inside the medical board's tribunal was a masterclass in sterile intimidation. It smelled of industrial-grade lemon polish and the stale, recycled air of high-stakes dread. This was not a clinic or a sanctuary for healing. It was an administrative kill floor designed to look like a corporate boardroom where careers were quietly taken out back and executed. The glass walls were thick, reflecting the fluorescent lights that hummed with a frequency that felt like a surgical drill against my temple. I sat alone on the left side. My hands were folded on the table, resting on the cold, bare wood. I had no water glass. I had no notepad. I had brought nothing except the white coat on my back and the absolute clinical certainty that I was about to watch a train wreck. Across the aisle, my brother, Tyler, adjusted his silk tie. He looked immaculate. His navy suit whispered chief of surgery to anyone close enough to smell the ambition. Tyler began his medical ethics speech, his voice dropping into that rehearsed, trustworthy baritone he usually reserved for grieving families. He talked about the sanctity of the profession and the burden of integrity. He was playing the role of the reluctant executioner perfectly. Behind him sat our parents, Gary and Stephanie. Gary's spine was rigid, his face carved from the same granite as the hospital lobby he had funded. Stephanie dabbed at her dry eyes, clutching a thick red folder as if it contained the nuclear codes. They were the victims here, the pillars of society who had birthed a fraud. I did not argue. I did not scoff. I simply reached for my tablet. While Tyler gained momentum, accusing me of performing 100 heart surgeries without a valid residency certificate, I sent a single encrypted message to my legal team. The data packet was small, but its weight was enough to sink a dynasty. I noticed the brittle confidence in my mother's knuckles as she gripped that evidence folder. They believed that because they were the Pierces, reality would simply bend to accommodate their narrative. They thought this was a ceremony to formalize my destruction. They had forgotten the one rule I had learned in the emergency room: never operate on a patient you have not fully scanned. Tyler looked at me, searching for fear. He wanted to see me sweating. But I just leaned back, allowing my shoulders to relax. I looked at him, the man who thought he was the director of this play, and I realized his expensive suit was nothing more than a costume. I knew exactly what the presiding auditor was doing in his chambers. He was realizing that the past he thought was buried had just sat down at his table. To understand why my brother sat in that hearing room with a predator's grin, you have to understand the house we grew up in. It was not a home. It was a high-performance laboratory where we were the specimens, and the price of survival was our absolute unwavering utility. My father, Gary, was a cardiothoracic surgeon who did not just save lives, he believed he granted them. He walked through the world with the cold arrogance of a man who had held a beating human heart in his hands and decided whether it deserved to keep its rhythm. I was the glitch in the Pierce software. It was not that I lacked skill. I was brilliant. I graduated at the top of my class, but in my father's eyes, I was merely a shadow, intended to make Tyler look more luminous. Tyler was the masterpiece, the golden child, who moved through his residency with mediocre grades, but a surplus of family connections. While I was performing the grueling, invisible labor of research and surgical prep, Tyler was the one accepting the handshakes in the hospital lobby. I had been the silent investor in their version of family footing, the emotional bill, while they overran my compassion like an unmonitored credit line. The night the contract was severed was a Tuesday in October. 14 years ago. I was 23. My father had presented me with a choice: join the Pierce Medical Group and spend my career as Tyler's permanent assistant, or face financial excommunication. I did not cry. I did not ask for a compromise. I simply put down my fork and walked out of the colonial estate that had become a prison without bars. Looking back, my silence then was not a sign of weakness. It was the invisible chain of a survivor. When you grow up in an environment where your only value is your obedience, you learn to treat your internal life like a classified file. People often ask why I stayed quiet for so long, why I allowed them to overlook my achievements while I worked 3 jobs to pay for my own specializing exams. What they didn't know was that my silence was a workspace. I spent those years filing independent medical patents under a shell company. By the time Tyler tried to strike, my royalties had secured me a whistleblower protection grant and a legal war chest they couldn't touch. They do not understand that for a victim of systematic neglect, silence is a survival mechanism. It is a way of building a fortress in the dark, where they cannot find you to tear you down. My silence was not a lack of courage, it was a strategic retreat. Sitting in this tribunal, I see that Gary and Stephanie still think I am that compliant 23-year-old. They believe my quietness today is a sign of my surrender. They do not realize that my compassion was a luxury they overdrafted years ago, and today I am finally closing the account. I am no longer a specimen in their lab. I am the auditor of their lies. Tyler leaned into the microphone, his posture radiating a calculated, predatory grace. He was not just presenting a case, he was performing an exorcism. He began projecting slides of patient records onto the glass wall behind the panel. He called my last 100 heart surgeries illegal acts of battery and described me as a ticking time bomb in a sterile field. He spoke about the sanctity of the operating room, as if I were a contaminant he was finally scrubbing away. I watched him, my face, a mask of clinical detachment. I noticed the way his fingers twitched ever so slightly, a microtremor born from a $550,000 secret. He was performing for the board, but he was also performing for Gary and Stephanie. He needed them to believe I was the failure so they would not look too closely at the deficit in his own department. Then came the moment they had choreographed for weeks. My father stood up, his movements as precise as a surgical incision. He did not look at me. He looked at the presiding auditor with a sorrowful, heavy-lidded expression that belonged on a Greek tragic stage. He and my mother, Stephanie, approached the lectern to sign a formal affidavit. They swore, under penalty of perjury, that they had seen my medical board exam failure letter a decade ago. As I watched my mother's elegant, looped signature hit the paper, I realized that for them, this was not an act of betrayal. In their minds, it was an act of preservation. This is the trap of normalized cruelty. In families like the Pierces, toxicity is not an occasional event. It is the climate. They did not see a daughter whose life they were destroying. They saw a brand risk they were successfully mitigating. When cruelty is normalized, it becomes an administrative task. You do not feel the sting of the knife when you are the one holding the handle for the greater good. My parents had spent 40 years convincing themselves that appearances were the only metric of reality. If the Pierce name was threatened, the source of the threat had to be amputated, even if that source shared their DNA. They had built a family culture where loyalty was a subscription service. And since I had stopped paying my dues by refusing to be their puppet, they were simply terminating the contract. Tyler looked back at the gallery and gave them a small, reassuring nod. It was the look of a man who thought he had just closed the final stitch on my career. He turned back to the panel, his voice regaining its resonant, trustworthy baritone. "We have submitted the affidavit," he declared. "The records, or rather the lack of them, speak for themselves. Lauren has been operating under a fraudulent license number, effectively bypassing our hospital's credentialing system for years. She is a fabrication, a ghost in a white coat who used a stolen identity to practice medicine, and it is our painful duty to lay that ghost to rest." The air in the room felt heavy, saturated with the weight of their collective lie. My mother dabbed her eyes again. The linen handkerchief was a white flag of false mourning. They were so confident in their scripted reality. They truly believed that because they had agreed on the lie, the universe would have no choice but to adopt it. They had forgotten that in medicine, as in law, the most dangerous infections are the ones you try to hide under a perfect bandage. I did not say a word. I simply looked at the closed door of the auditor's chambers and waited for the fever to break. The door to the auditor's chambers did not just open. It swung back with a violent finality that caused the thick glass walls of the tribunal to vibrate. The lead board member, Dr. Eris Thorne, did not walk, he marched. He was no longer carrying the red folder Tyler had presented with such theatrical flourish. That folder was gone, discarded like the contaminant it was. Instead, he held a single manila case file stamped with the official gold embossed seal of the State Board of Medical Examiners. He did not sit down. He stood over the bench, looking at my brother with eyes that had seen every variety of professional sin and found them all utterly boring. Until this moment, the silence in the room was not empty. It was the silence of a guillotine blade hanging at the absolute top of its track. "Mr. Pierce," Dr. Thorne said. His voice was no longer a gravelly baritone. It was a high, thin strain of cold fury that made his words tremble. "Mr. Pierce, you stood in this tribunal under oath and alleged that the respondent deceived the board by using a counterfeit license number to perform surgery. You submitted a document dated July 2012 claiming her original application was rejected for ethics violations." Tyler smoothed his tie, his confident smirk wavering only at the very edges. "That is correct, Your Honor. We have the affidavit from our parents. The evidence is irrefutable." "Irrefutable," Thorne repeated, tasting the word like spoiled medicine. He opened the manila file. "I took the liberty of contacting the Director of Records personally during this recess. I did not check the digital database your independent background screening firm allegedly searched records that are easily manipulated by someone with your administrative credentials. I had them pull the physical microfiche from the vault, the hard copy archives that cannot be hacked, modified, or deleted." Tyler's face went pale, but he was too far out on the limb to retreat. He did not realize the branch was already being sawed off behind him. "And do you know what I found, Mr. Pierce?" Thorne asked, his gaze drilling into my brother. He pulled a document from the file, the ink still fresh and warm from the fax machine. "License number 18429, issued November 2012. Status, active, good standing, no disciplinary history. Owner, Lauren Pierce." My mother gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in the acoustic vacuum. Thorne was not finished. He picked up the fake failure letter Tyler had forged. "I looked at your letter, Tyler. You see this signature at the bottom? The signature of the State Medical Administrator, Thomas J. Miller?" Tyler nodded, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Thomas Miller was a colleague of mine," Thorne whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "But Thomas Miller retired in 2010. He was playing golf in Florida when this letter was supposedly written in 2012. Thorne leaned forward, his face inches from the microphone. "Not only is your sister a licensed surgeon, but the records show she was the 2012 valedictorian of her class. She is, in fact, a significantly better doctor than the one standing in front of me right now." The room shifted physically. The panel members, who had looked at me with clinical suspicion an hour ago, were now staring at Tyler with expressions of pure horror. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the color drain from my brother's face until he was the color of wet ash. The script had broken. The teleprompter was black, and the only person left on the stage was the one they had tried to erase. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and clinical. I did not need to shout. The data on the screen did that for me. I leaned forward, my voice flat as a heart monitor as I addressed the panel. "The PDF your chief of surgery submitted was not created 10 years ago," I stated, tapping the screen. "The independent digital forensic audit I commissioned traced the unique MAC address directly to the private laptop registered to my brother's office. The system logs show this document was uploaded through a high-level administrative override. Specifically, it was authorized using a biometric fingerprint scan at midnight on October 14th, when the administrative wing was empty. Unless a hacker broke into his private suite and stole his thumbprint, the chief of surgery is the only person who could have planted this forgery." Then I delivered the finisher. I pulled up the internal audits my team had secured. I spent months coordinating with the district attorney's office. They've been waiting for this hearing to confirm the final piece of the fraud before moving in. But the board might wonder why. Why would a man with everything risk his career to bury a solo practitioner? He's struck now because I recently filed for international exclusivity on my new cardiac valves, a multi-million-dollar asset. Tyler's creditors were closing in, and my patent was his only escape route. Tyler did not just want me gone, he needed my patents. He has a gambling habit he calls speculative investing. He owes $550,000 to an offshore group, and he has a hole in his hospital's endowment fund worth $200,000 more. He planned to absorb my research and my surgical contracts to cover his own theft. I looked at my brother, whose immaculate suit now looked like a shroud. This was the moment his reality dissolved. Tyler's position was never built on character. It was a luxury he had rented with money and a borrowed name. When your status is just a costume bought with stolen capital, you do not have an internal foundation to break your fall. Once the money is gone and the secrets are out, there is nothing left but a hollow man in an expensive chair. He was not losing his power tonight. He was being forced to admit he never really had it. Gary and Stephanie sat in the gallery, gray with a new kind of terror. They had signed their names to a felony to protect a brand that was currently burning to the ground. They had bet on the Golden Boy, only to realize he was the one who had been bleeding them dry. Sheriff's deputies entered the room, the heavy clink of handcuffs echoing against the glass walls. Tyler shrieked my name, pleading for me to tell them it was a mistake. I did not turn around. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. This was not a family tragedy. It was a balance sheet finally being settled. The silence that followed Tyler's departure was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of absolute judgment. The air in the tribunal room felt scrubbed clean, like the atmosphere after a violent thunderstorm has finally broken a summer heat wave. I sat at the table for a moment, my hands resting on the cool wood. Behind me, I could hear the wet, ragged breathing of my mother, a sound meant to elicit sympathy, but it now sounded like the gasps of a drowning swimmer who finally realizes the lifeboat has already left. I stood up and walked toward the heavy glass doors. My legs felt steady. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like I was fighting to be seen. I felt like I was simply living. I pushed through the doors and into the marble hallway. The corridor echoed with the footsteps of lawyers and board members, but the path to the elevator was blocked. 2 sheriff's deputies were holding my brother near the water fountain. He was not in cuffs yet, but he was effectively restrained. Tyler looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. His tie was loose, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wild, darting around like a trapped animal. When he saw me, he lunged forward, but the deputies held him back. "Lauren!" he shouted, his voice raw and stripped of all corporate polish. "Lauren, wait! You have to talk to them. Tell the board to withdraw the referral. They are going to revoke my medical license. I will lose everything." I stopped 5 feet away from him. It was close enough to smell the fear on him, a sour scent that cut through his expensive cologne. "I cannot withdraw anything, Tyler," I said calmly. "It is out of my hands. It is the state's case now. But you are family," he pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. "You cannot destroy your own family." "I did not destroy this family, Tyler," I said, my voice quiet and hard as a diamond. "You did. You planted the bomb. You lit the fuse. You just did not expect to be the one holding it when it went off." My parents stumbled out of the room behind me. My mother let out a low wail when she saw Tyler being held. Gary marched over to me, ignoring the ruin of his son. "We need to talk privately, Lauren. You need to recant your testimony and refuse to cooperate with the district attorney. I will make this disappear. I will reinstate you in the will and give you the capital to expand your practice." I laughed. It was a genuine sound that startled him. "You think I want your money, Gary? I just beat the best surgeons in the city with a laptop and 2 researchers. I do not need your capital, and I certainly don't need a name that is about to be plastered all over the crime section of the newspaper." "I am your father," he roared, his face flushing purple. "You owe me." "I owe you nothing," I said. "I paid my debts the day I walked out of your house 14 years ago. The invoice is settled." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thin stack of documents. I handed them to my father. He took them reflexively, staring down at the legal header, "Cease and desist," and petition for permanent restraining order. "What is this?" he whispered. "It is a formal notice," I said. You, Stephanie, and Tyler are never to contact me again. You are not to come within 500 feet of my home or my clinic. Once the judge signs this petition, any violation will lead to your immediate arrest for contempt. Don't test me. This was the act of letting go of blood ties to finally find myself. For too long, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, paying for a subscription that only brought me pain. Cutting toxic ties is not an act of hate. It is a profound act of self-preservation and a refusal to be defined by people who only value your utility. I signed the petitioner line with a steady hand, black and permanent. I turned my back on the ghosts of my past and walked toward the light of the exit. 6 months after the hearing, I stood in the lobby of the newly opened Eleanor Medical Foundation. We established this organization to provide legal support and educational funding for medical students who are being exploited or overlooked by the systems they serve. The Pierce name no longer follows me into the operating room. I have reclaimed my own name. And looking out at the city skyline, I finally understand that the most powerful form of revenge is simply becoming everything they said you could never be. I have come to realize that justice is a hammer. It can be used to shatter a false idol, yes, but its true value is in building a house that finally feels like home. If you find yourself in a similar situation, if you feel like the black sheep or the one constantly pushed to the edge, I want you to hear this as a letter directly to you. You are not a glitch in the software. You were just placed in a narrative that was far too small to hold your light. Being at the edge is not a sign of failure. It is a vantage point. It allows you to see the cracks in the foundation before anyone else does. Sometimes, the greatest gift toxic people can give you is their rejection, because it forces you to build something better than the scraps they were offering in the first place. Forgiveness is not always about a seat at their table. Sometimes, it is the quiet act of letting go to set yourself free. If Lauren's victory gave you hope, hit the like button and subscribe to the My Revenge Stories channel. Do not let toxic ties hold you back. The truth always wins.